Hey TechKnowStuds, in this video we're going to take a deeper dive into vulnerabilities. We'll start out by just a quick rehash of what a vulnerability is. We'll talk about vulnerability types, and then we're going to get into just briefly about the life cycle of software vulnerabilities. All right, in our example here, we have an asset that we want to protect. And so in this case right here, it is some sort of data. And we put up walls around it, and we put up a gate so that not just anybody can come by, the hacker can't come by and just grab that data and run off with it. But these technologies that we use, this wall and this gate, have some sort of vulnerabilities to it. So an example is that there is a lock on this gate, and that lock can be picked or broken to open up the gate and get inside of it. Or the gate itself is not as strong as the wall, so the gate can be broken down, and so that way a hacker could get to this data. Or perhaps there's no ceiling on this structure that we have here, so perhaps there's a way they can scale the wall and get into the data. Or depending on what the ground is like, maybe they can tunnel underneath to get to this data. So these are vulnerabilities that we have that gives some exposure to this data here of getting out and susceptible to this threat. So there's three types of vulnerabilities that we have. First of all is a technological vulnerability. So an inherent problem with the technology that allows for this vulnerability to be available to a hacker. We also have the configuration vulnerability, that if things are not configured correctly, if somebody leaves the gate open, they leave the gate open. So there's a configuration vulnerability that we have with different technologies. And then we have the security policy itself. And this is the rules that we set up to govern how we operate. And there are some weaknesses in how we approach some of that as well. So in our example here, we said some of the vulnerabilities is the lock on the gate itself, going over or under the wall here. And so there's perhaps some technological vulnerabilities to having this wall and this gate around this data. It's the same thing with equipment. When you set up equipment, there's some weaknesses in the operating system or the firmware that's operating this equipment. There's programs that are on that hardware, and the programs themselves have weaknesses to them. Or perhaps those programs are using different protocols, and certain protocols have certain weaknesses to them. And so there's weaknesses throughout all of this. From a technological standpoint, your networking equipment can have weaknesses that are built into it at multiple levels here. Then we have a configuration weakness. Because your devices and your technologies, they have operating systems, they have software that's installed on that, they have services that are running on that, they come with all of this stuff to make them operate, and there's lots of configurations that can happen on there. And so maybe it's not a weakness in the software itself, but how you configure that software. And the example here would be, let's say you walk away and you leave the gate open, or maybe you leave it unlocked, then any hacker can come by and access that data. It's the same thing on your computer. If you walk away from your computer and it's open and you're on a piece of equipment, somebody can come by, sit down, install their own credentials on the system, and now they're in. Now, and they don't even need to necessarily install their credentials on there. Maybe you get a piece of equipment that has the username and password that is a default username and password, and you don't reconfigure it to something more secure. And now anybody can get onto that device and start leveraging that device. Perhaps maybe there's some software or some data that's supposed to be encrypted, and you don't get on there, and there's you don't encrypt it, or you do poor encryption on it, and now that is vulnerable to the outside world. So there's lots of examples in this. And really, out of the three of these, technological, configuration, and security policy, I run into more issues with configuration than anything else. So let me say that again. From a triad experience, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I have more issues with people misconfiguring the equipment wrong and exposing having that data or having that equipment exposed to the outside world than anything else. So this is one to really watch out for, and it's one that really needs a lot of controls around to make sure that you're doing this correctly. So watch out for this configuration. Then there's weaknesses in your security policies. Your security policies are things, there's rules, there's guidelines, there's procedures, there's a bunch of things that you will set up and instruct your employees to do to make sure that we are not opening up any kind of issues on our networks and any kind of issues that are opening up our assets to threats. And so what can happen is you could just lack these altogether. Maybe you don't have any security policies at all. Or maybe those security policies exist, they're just not cleared, or they're not specific enough. Or perhaps you're not telling people, you're not educating people on those security policies. Maybe they're incomplete and they're only halfway written. Maybe people know what the security policy is, they just don't follow the security policy. And that, I've definitely seen that in companies a lot before. And if you don't have some sort of policy enforcement where you're actively trying to seek out to see if people are following your policies or not, you will have people that don't follow those policies. So really, security policy is one that I think is overlooked in a lot of companies. And so out of these, I would rank configuration has probably been our biggest problem in the past that I've seen at the places that I've worked. Lack of security policy would be the second, and then there's the technological, and we will get more into some of the technological issues with networking equipment and different protocols. So those are some vulnerability types. So let's talk about the life cycle of these vulnerabilities. It starts out as these updates get released, and at this point in time, it's not really well known. And so a hacker comes along and they may discover this. At this point in time, this is called 0 day. It's when the hacker understands a vulnerability and can leverage the vulnerability, but it's not widely known. Not everybody knows about this vulnerability yet. But over time, this vulnerability gets broadcasted out and more people realize that this vulnerability is out there. And then the next stage of this is it goes into the CVE, or the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures. So this is a list of all of the exposures and vulnerabilities that are out there. And this is a good thing. In some ways, what happens is that now more hackers will know about this vulnerability, but on the flip side, now that it's been sent out into the public and people are aware of it, the companies that have released the hardware or software can go now and fix their hardware and software. They come out with a patch. And so that way, the next in this life cycle right here is there's patches and updates that come out to update it to do away with this vulnerability. So one thing that you want to do with this is you want to limit your exposure. So you want to limit the time that it's in these two stages here. And you do that by patching often and making sure that you're using vendors and stuff that have that are still supporting their hardware and their software, and that you are up to date with your licensing so you can continue to get these patches and updates. So there you have it. We talked about what vulnerabilities there are, the 3 different types of vulnerabilities, whether it's technological, configuration, or security policies. And then we talked about the life cycle of software vulnerabilities, everything from 0 day to the CVE and to patches and updates, and how patches and updates then get deployed. I hope these videos are really helping you out. If it is, could you hit that like button?